Unemployment rates across the globe soared to unheard percentages. Not just unemployment, but also underemployment, driven by a shift to gig work, will prove to be a formidable problem to overcome. And therefore, the future of work in the new normal is the subject of this conference. The last few months have triggered the widespread realization that our existing economic model is broken. There is now real momentum for change and growing solidarity among us.
Pre-COVID, existing trends of inequalities and gender gaps have been further accelerated by the pandemic. The job market has become even more challenging, particularly for the youth, with many people suffering unemployment, job and salary cuts. Again, women are particularly hit hard by the COVID-19 crisis in terms of fair distribution, since the pandemic and related social restrictions have also led to the re-traditionalization of home and care work division.
In the advanced economies, suddenly they rediscovered the joys of fiscal expansion. In developed country governments are spending 20% of GDP, 15%. I mean, pretty much everybody is spending 10% or more. In the developing world, in fact, there's been very little. And this is because partly there are concerns about sovereign debt, capital flight, and how private markets will respond, and particularly the credit rating agencies. Governments are now obsessed with the idea that they cannot run large fiscal deficits, even in a crisis like this, when all sources of effective demand other than public spending have collapsed. The third big intensification is to do with the nature of work and the increasing automation. The other tendencies of inequality, there is a major issue with respect to the gender divide. You know, the neoliberal philosophy that has guided economic policy making for the last 20, 30 years has really undermined any kind of social recognition or appreciation of a huge amount of the work done by women, unpaid in homes and in communities, and underpaid by society, because care work is not really seen as work in the same way. The pandemic has been worst in the countries that do not have adequate health care, and it is creating economies that are not going to recover in the near future at all. We clearly need much more significant fiscal expansion across the developing world. That expansion has to be led by public spending rather than by tax cuts. And it has to be public spending, putting money in the hands of the people who are more likely to spend it, to generate multiplier effects. And public spending that is geared to ensuring a properly functioning care sector. All kinds of things that we don't often factor in adequately in terms of what we want for our societies.
It is important to recognize that the world has been very different in the last 40 years or so compared to the previous times. What was different was essentially what might be referred to as the neoliberal counter-revolution against Keynesian economics and against development economics. In other words, against the role of the state. It was presumed, the rise of neoliberalism, that the state could only do harm, it could never do good. And this view has basically prevailed. One of the major features which have transformed the world, this feature which many people refer to as financialization, has seen, one, the strengthening of the power of banks, but not just the traditional commercial banks which intermediated between savings and investments, but also, very, very importantly, other financial institutions which have played a tremendous role in the economy, which now shape the functioning of stock markets. So all this has led to a new type of economy, what has been termed shareholder value extraction. Abuse by powerful shareholders has become quite rampant. The so-called captains of industry, the G20 countries, while preaching trade liberalization to the rest of the world, introduce various actions which amount to economic protection. The amount of economic protection introduced 2009, for instance, after the advent of the global financial crisis, was tremendous and has continued to grow since then. So this false choice between life and livelihoods is actually a reflection of the failure of the authorities, because what is needed in response to this crisis is precisely that all of government approaches and a whole of society response. It has been very difficult for work as normal to continue precisely because of these very, very major disruptions, not only at the workplace, but also in schools and many other places where people tend to come together. Now, many of the countries which have been affected have introduced various monetary and fiscal responses. Unfortunately, fiscal responses have not been bold enough. Part of the reason is because there has been a reluctance of governments to borrow in order to spend. There's absolutely no reason for such hesitation. And in fact, by doing so, those governments concerned are actually making the situation far, far worse than it needs to be. Many of the measures which have been introduced, which have been borrowed from the West, rather than looking at the Asian society's concern, for example, paying employers to retain their workers during the period of subsidy, they have done very little for the huge informal sectors which exist in most of societies. Now, one of the major challenges is that COVID-19, physical distancing and other requirements of COVID-19 have disrupted supply chains in a major way. The trend towards offshoring, which was already interrupted with the global financial crisis from 2008 or so, has seen reversal to reshoring. The supply chains which we have become accustomed to are no longer going to be there, and we will need to begin to think very seriously about how to adjust to this situation.
What we see again as a response to the pandemic globally, it's not just Jayati alluded to governments going into fiscal expansionary policy, but actually there was also monetary loosening up, very much the way that that happened in 2008. Interest rate were driven almost to nothing, but there was fiscal expansion. But this whole dynamics that created a capacity to cater to demand of a certain nature, certain size. Post-COVID, it needs a readjustment, and this mismatch is one of those things that will have to be taken into account in policy response. If firms recover to do the same things that they were doing, then that's a good thing. But if the economy recovers by doing other things, then all this installed capacity, especially the ones for the export market that's already been in place, will remain unused. And therefore, unemployment, I think, will be the biggest problem that this country has to face. We need to look deeper into this issue of regional, not ASEAN, 10 member states kind of thing, but even bilateral, trilateral kind of working together.
During the MCO period, there is no sales, there's no revenue at all. Yeah? And only a few percentage of the companies say, yes, they have some sale. And of course, when we say that, okay, since you don't have any sales, how do you finance your operation? So close to 69% of the companies say they use their own savings in order for them to actually survive during that period. So this is showing that most of the companies really, they don't have so much reserve in that sense. You know, most of them say that, yeah, they require more than 6 months to recover. 2% say that they will never recover. Of course, you know, these numbers here, you know, is interesting because we're talking about at least 800,000 registered companies in Malaysia, and if about 2% are not able to continue because of the situation, then of course the net impact can be serious.
COVID, I think this area of automation and digitalization has become a key agenda on many firms, large and small. For big firms, you might be thinking of issues such as smart factory, smart manufacturing. But for smaller firms, you see that online and e-commerce platform has become a lifeline during the COVID lockdown. Most of the SME, the small and medium enterprises that make up the large part of companies in Southeast Asia, they do not have the financial strength to remain so strong under this kind of demand shock. The logistic risk when demands and logistic and transportation are disrupted, never before that they experience this kind of shock in their logistical system. Now, companies in this area of the world have to invest more in technology. That would add to a lot of costs, and that would mean that the challenge that are facing the business that we can look at is that there would be a lot of increase in costs in terms of balancing the need for investment in technology, as well as the need to look at how they can still maintain their efficiency from maintaining the operation.
We need to adapt, or we need to implement very harmonious way, harmonious system, which can ensure different economic players work together. Thank you.
It's still challenging to organize and to mobilize the drivers to be recognized as workers that entitled to labor rights. The exact problem is exactly the questions that been raised by Professor Luce, that there's no regulation to protect the driver, no recognitions as to the drivers or overall in general the gig economy workers. The regulations that have been produced so far, mostly on transportation and the legalizations of the app-based transport operations, which was illegal in the couple of years. It's just legalized recently. And the other point is that there was no engagement. There hasn't been engagement from Labor Ministry or Human Resource Ministry in Malaysian context in regulating the workers' rights in the gig economy, such as drivers. But as I have found in our research, there are massive mobilizations, organizing going on. We are very hopeful and optimistic that we'll be able to organize and we'll push the government and also the companies to be respectful to the labor rights.
Also, I think one of the issues facing a lot of countries is that, as in Malaysia, a lot of social protection is actually built around the formal job landscape. So you have your mandatory contributions from your wages or salaries. But in Malaysia, for example, I think looking at the EPF numbers specifically, we've been seeing a steady drop, especially over the last decade and a half or so, in the number of regular salaried workers. The reality is that it has never been a majority in the Malaysian labor market. I think we peaked out just before the COVID crisis. We peaked out at about 5.3 million regular salaried workers. We have 7+ million in terms of active contributors, but a lot of that, roughly about 2 million or so, is actually more like part-time or temporary work where there are contributions. But if you're talking about somebody who's actually going to an office, getting a salary, and then they're having the deduction every month, we're just talking about 5.3 million. And it has dropped to something like 4.7 million as of today. So that's out of a workforce of about 15.6, if I'm not mistaken. So maybe just 1/3 of the private sector is actually holding down a steady job. So that portion of the labor force obviously enjoys social protection in the form of EPF, also in the form of SOCSO, but that leaves out roughly about almost 10 million people. About 1.5 million are under the government, so they're covered under the government pension scheme, but that still leaves about 8.5 million. You take away the self-employed, and you come to figure about 6 to 7 million. We have a very, very large portion of our labor force that's not covered by any kind of formal protection scheme. Now, what other countries have done with this is that there are a number of approaches to do this. One, you can try to make it mandatory. In other words, regardless of where your income comes from, you have to contribute to a retirement fund or a social insurance scheme. I think that's the approach that Singapore has taken. I think Korea has done the same thing. I think a lot of Europeans do that as well. But the problem there, I think even under such systems, there's still gaps. If I'm not mistaken, the coverage in Singapore is roughly about 85%. So they're still leaving out about 15% of the workforce. Same thing in Korea, and I think in Europe as well. There is a lot of interest in redesigning social protection systems around informal work. But I haven't found anybody to come up with a perfect solution yet. It's an imperfect world, unfortunately.
E-commerce platforms here, the biggest one is Taobao, owned by Alibaba, that they also create massive mechanisms to increase the competition between all the industrial companies, most of them small and medium-sized enterprises that supply to these networks. And this has massive impact on the economic situation. It massively stifles competition, leads to cutthroat competition between the companies, and finally also to a significant informalization of industrial work, which means as the volumes for the e-commerce based trade often grow smaller and smaller, but the delivery requirements and the flexibility requirements and the time requirements are getting tougher and tougher. The small and medium-sized companies do a lot of out-contracting of certain work, let's say sewing of garment or making some consumer goods or the components for it, to very small or even family-based companies. And this, in fact, is some kind of gig work in manufacturing. We think this is also a very, very important question that needs consideration and, of course, political regulation. I would be interested to hear a little more from Indonesia, Malaysia, and other countries present here in this discussion about this experience.
I think, to be honest, it's hard to say, right? Because on one hand, it may not be a healthy development, but if jobs and also sort of industrial processes, business processes are going to higher fragmentation and sort of unbundling of more and more unbundling of different tasks, maybe jobs may be becoming more towards, addressing certain tasks. And I think Isham did also mention it in his talk. So I think to us, yes, it could be, to me, it could be, yes, transitional, difficult, but if this is the reality of what future work may become, then therefore I think you need policies to deal with it. In a way, we are saying that it's not about whether we want to, but it's just when will that come true. It may not end up as such. Things may change. But I think the way I think about gig economy is that given that the rising trend is coming in, it seems like this will be part of the future of work, with even a large minority of workers, even in a lower bound, will be in this kind of work. How then do we think about securing their work, right? Securing their lives, and also helping them have that consistent upskills, upgrading, and so on, to be able to find the next job, and the next job. So yeah, that's how I see it.
We would like to stress this out due to Malaysia currently totally feels the impact of this pandemic crisis for almost 25% workers losing their jobs. Secondly, it's basically a game changer. So apps-based company for e-hailing currently switch their game plan into delivery mode. Hence, more people's locked down in their house as per regulated ordinance. So the implication we can see, more Grab driver in Malaysia have to switch their work from ferrying passengers into delivery methods, such as delivery products or even delivery food for that matter. And we're looking at the supply and demand. Currently are overloaded by supply into this industry, which there is no appropriate control measure by the apps e-hailing company to control on the supply of demand at certain locations. This will cause of supply over demand rather than control through their system base. Basically, what else we can say is definitely it can be a good thing to the drivers, whereby they have more jobs on delivery and so on. However, in terms of transporting people, it has been reduced, I would say, up to until only 25% of people are using the Grab transportation. But after the EMCO recently, so basically we can see the increase of people that are using the app. However, these three criteria is the main elements that we are looking into.
And I think healthcare workers become more resilient, and not just healthcare workers. I think everyone who's been affected by this whole pandemic, be it gig workers and healthcare workers, anyone, we'd come out stronger. We'd be more open to ideas of how things can be done differently, how to actually cope with all these constantly changing and dynamic times, of how to adapt, how to cope with all these tough times and things like that. So I think rather than, obviously we'd be very much a better person in terms of our immune response will be much greater, but I think physically and mentally we'd come out of this as better people in terms of healthcare workers. And this hopefully would instill passion amongst younger generations to understand that when it comes to medical work, it's not just about being a doctor. It's not just about being a nurse. I think at this point, it's to say that, oh yay, I'll live through a pandemic and I've came out alive. And there's so many things, there's so many paradigms to medical work. It's not just about being a doctor. I could even become a research. I could design a vaccine. I could save the world. So
But the labor market insufficiently generates skilled jobs, matching those qualifications. And of course, on the supply side, there's issues about quality of education and training as well. So we go from employment to wages. Now, it is higher for the lowest paid workers, and the youngest also tend to be in that category. And I think this reflects the effects of minimum wage. Where it is more sluggish is among young adults, so more workers in their 20s. But there's an interesting contrast there. Broad-based and quality jobs and self-employment programs. Malaysia needs to move out of low-wage, low-skill, labor-intensive modes. It's sort of this ongoing and decades-long challenge that we're still not really, I think, seeing that breakthrough. Living wages, sustaining wage growth, decent work. So we see that the lowest earners are supported by minimum wage. I think that is noble, it's necessary, it must continue. But there are gaps here and there, and I think one that stands out is in the middle, semi-skilled workers, where they have not protected by the wage floor, minimum wage type of interventions, maybe not even qualifying for a lot of social assistance, but also also weak bargaining power and low earnings growth.
Let's look at the data from the World Bank. This statistics said that 15.8% of the Indonesia youth, 15 to 24 years old ages, is quite higher compared even with the Malaysia, with the China, even with the Timor-Leste and India. And for the youth not in education, employment or training, this is quite high, 21.4%, again, quite high compared with the peer country in ASEAN. So education, training is also lack in Indonesia. That's why the government want to shortcut to open opportunity for foreign worker instead of beginning to have a good academic, for instance, and good university training. So this is also creating another problem, because we see that if we're talking about the digital booming, even in the pandemic, some people is beginning to move to transfer their consumption base to the digital e-commerce, for instance, but the talent in Indonesia is most problematic things about the future of the world. I want to suggest that in the country, for instance, like Indonesia, what we need is the holistic national talent plan. So how come we discuss about the future of work when 30% of the baby in Indonesia is stunting? There's the problem of the basic, how to compete with the international worker or the foreign worker if we still suffering the lack of nutrition for our baby.
Many youth are now working for Uber or Grab or other transport platforms as food delivery workers, in retail and grocery, as click workers to provide small service to companies like such as a small survey, data collection, or producing an online advertisements rather than traditional model of companies. Another point about skills for work 4.0, that is work in the fourth industrial revolution. And I thank Burma for complimenting Vietnam. But in fact, skills for work 4.0 is still a gray color in Vietnam, because knowledge of skills needed for work 4.0 among the youth in Vietnam is unclear. As well as education system is not qualified enough to provide training on skills for work 4.0. Youth is the future of the economy, and they need more attention in the policy making to increase their employability in a secure job in the new normal. So here's some of my recommendations. First, trade unions need to discuss on organizing youth and how to organize them in the platform and gig economy and how trade unions work. Third, non-standard employment need to be regulated under employment law and labor law.
When we talk about the future of work, this issue of the value of work and why there's a disconnect between the contribution that workers will make to society. For example, farm and agricultural fishery workers contributing to society in the biggest global food crisis in 50 years. Their contribution has intrinsic value, but it doesn't have recognized economic and financial value. It doesn't translate into decent wages and good working conditions. And I think that's very important to understand why. The primary reason is because the value of work is not related to skills, potential, and possibilities. The value of work is related to vulnerability. It's still locked into vulnerability, and we have to break that. And we need the right of freedom of association to be able to counterbalance the power as new technology comes in. It's the only way to ensure that the future of work is a future with dignity. But more than ever, having that secure job is a matter of life and death in many countries, and so that remains a critical priority. I think the problem is that it's not really about skills and lower skilled or higher skilled. What I'm suggesting is that employers are now changing the very meaning of skills to be in a very different way. And I think to be highly skilled 10, 15 years from now will be a very different concept of what you might have today. And that has very serious implications for a number of things, including education policy.
We are now having a situation where, with the disappearance of US middle class, countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, to a lesser extent the Philippines, and other parts of Asian countries, we have nowhere to export to. And that is a serious question that we have to deal with. And anything that actually moves us forward will need to be based on some form of solidarity between our part of the world, the workers in our part of the world, and the workers in places like United States, Europe, Australia, and other first world countries. Only with some form of basic standards for workers that is not jeopardizing and not threatening their well-being, and that pay them decently, recognize the needs of dignified works, both in the United States, Europe, Australia, and in our part of the world. Now, the state needs to think about how to play a more activist role. The state cannot sit back and watch millions of people living under low income, low pay, or see millions of people with underemployment. Even if they are employed in many of our societies, they are underpaid, underemployed, and not living a decent life even if they work very hard. And the state has to think of completing certain mission in the economy. The growth should not be for its own sake, and the economy is not just about growth. The economy has to have achieved a certain objective, certain common good, and the economy or the intervention of the state in the economy is about to achieve a certain mission. And particularly, there needs to be sufficient decent pay job in order to create sufficient income, and with income create demand.